The merciless winter of 1814 held no reverence for aristocratic blood. Its biting frost numbed dukes and roadside vagrants with equal indifference. Lord Julian Stirling, Duke of Ravenswood, spurred his stallion furiously through the blinding tempest, desperate to reach the shelter of his ancestral hearth. His gaze barely registered the motionless bundle collapsed against the frozen snowbank, just another forgotten casualty of the northern freeze. Yet as his mount surged past, a sharp glimpse of deep navy broadcloth seized his attention, the tarnished silver livery buttons, the unmistakably tailored military cut. It was his own greatcoat. Julian held absolute contempt for the snow. Romantic poets scribbled verses praising its pristine silence. Pampered gentlewomen clapped in delight behind leaded glass casements. Julian recognized the frost for what it truly was, an executioner. The temperature had plunged 20 degrees below freezing. Biting gales swept across the barren Yorkshire moors, driving sharp shards of ice that lacerated exposed skin like crushed crystal. Tucking his chin deep into the upturned collar of his woolen mantle, Julian relied entirely upon his black stallion Titan to navigate the buried road. London lay 2 exhausting days behind him. Ravenswood Hall was less than 5 miles ahead. He merely had to survive the hour. The surrounding countryside was swallowed in a blank white abyss. Hedgerows were smothered. Ancient oaks raised skeletal boughs against a leaden sky. Suddenly Titan shied violently, snorting plumes of white vapor. "Steady beast," Julian growled, hauling back on the frozen leather reins. The massive stallion sidestepped his iron-shod hooves, breaking through the frozen crust of the drift. Julian peered down into the ditch. Half buried beneath the snow lay an indistinct dark mound. A body. Julian's jaw tightened into stone. He did not halt. He was a peer of the realm, not an itinerant savior. The parish workhouses were overflowing with souls who had succumbed to the elements. Had he stopped for every frozen corpse in the kingdom, he would never set foot in his own hall. He pressed his heels into Titan's flanks. The stallion took 1 step, then 2. A sudden savage gust stripped the powdery surface from the mound. Julian hauled on the reins, arresting his mount in mid-stride. His hands had acted before his intellect could intervene. A corner of heavy wool had whipped free from the snowbank. It was navy blue, dense, military-grade Yorkshire wool of the finest weave. As Julian stared, a single silver button caught the dull pewter twilight. Stamped upon its face was a snarling wolf, the ancient crest of House Ravenswood. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. A sharp, phantom agony struck his ribs. It was an overcoat he had not laid eyes upon in 14 months. A coat he had draped across the shivering shoulders of a young woman upon a Mayfair terrace, moments before she vanished into the night without a trace. He vaulted from the saddle. The snowbank swallowed his riding boots past the knees as he fought through the drift, his breath pluming in jagged clouds. "Hello," he rasped, his voice instantly torn away by the gale. He reached the figure. It was a woman drawn into a tight, desperate ball. Crystalline frost clung to her eyelashes and the frayed hem of her woolen hood. Julian seized the shoulder of the heavy navy coat and pulled. She was terrifyingly light, her limbs locked in the unyielding stiffness of hypothermia. Julian swore a harsh, guttural sound. Dropping to his knees, heedless of the freezing slush soaking through his buckskin breeches, he caught her beneath the arms and hauled her out of the ditch. "Wake up, damn you! Open your eyes." Her head fell back limp against his arm. The frozen hood fell away. Julian froze. The screaming wind seemed to fall silent. The biting cold evaporated, replaced by a violent wave of heat surging up his neck. Genevieve. Her cheeks were sunken, her skin the shade of skimmed milk. Her lips were cracked, stained with a terrifying tint of pale violet. This was not the radiant, sharp-witted gentlewoman who had matched his intellect in candlelit drawing rooms. This was a wraith, a starved, broken spectre. "Evie," he whispered. The bitter fury he had harbored for over a year, the humiliating agony of being deserted 3 days before their wedding, vanished instantly. Panic took its place. He tore off his leather glove with his teeth and pressed bare fingers against the hollow of her throat. Frigid, so terribly cold. But there a faint, fluttering rhythm like the heartbeat of a wounded sparrow. He gathered her against his chest, preparing to carry her to the horse. As he shifted her weight, the oversized navy coat fell open. A faint, reedy wail pierced the howling storm. Julian stopped breathing. He looked down. Tucked entirely within the lining of his greatcoat, pressed flush against Genevieve's chest to absorb the final embers of her body. Heat was a bundle of coarse rags. The bundle squirmed. A tiny scarlet, furious face peered out from the frayed wool. "Un infant." Julian stared at the child, then at the woman who had shattered his world. She had wrapped the babe in his coat, his protection, shielding them both even across their estrangement. God in heaven, Julian breathed. There was no time for mathematics, no time for betrayal. He pulled the coat firmly around the infant, hoisted Genevieve across his shoulder like a fallen comrade, and fought his way back to the road. A deserted gamekeeper's stone lodge stood a mile off the carriage road. Julian knew the terrain intimately. He had taken refuge there during his boyhood hunts. Now it represented their sole chance at survival. Ravenswood Hall was too distant. The frost would claim her before they reached the lodge gates. He kicked the heavy oak door open with a violent thud, sending decades of dust cascading from the rafters. The interior smelled of damp earth and dry rot, but it was sealed against the gale. Julian laid Genevieve upon the rough wooden pallet in the corner. He moved with cold, mechanical efficiency. He dared not look upon her face. To look was to remember, and to remember was to hesitate. Gathering dry kindling stacked beside the stone hearth, he piled it, haphazardly struck his flint, and blew upon the spark until a golden flame caught the dry straw. Smoke billowed into the room, stinging his eyes before the draught caught the flue. "Catch, damn you," he muttered, feeding logs into the grate until the stone chimney roared with heat. Only then did he return to the cot. Genevieve had not stirred. The infant was wailing louder now, a thin, reedy cry of pure distress. Julian dropped to his knees beside the bed. His hands were trembling. He, the Duke of Ravenswood, who had coldly stared down pistols at dawn and commanded respect in the House of Lords, could not steady his fingers. He reached for the child. He had to gently pry Genevieve's arms apart. Even unconscious, even on the brink of death, her fingers were locked in an iron grip around the infant. "Release him, Evie," he murmured the old endearment, slipping past his lips like blood from a fresh wound. "I have him." Her grip finally loosened. Julian lifted the bundle. It was a boy, frail, far too small, perhaps 4 months from his first breath. The child was shivering violently, tiny fists clenched against the chill. Stripping off his own woolen jacket, Julian laid it before the hearth and wrapped the infant securely within its folds. The radiant heat washed over the child, and the desperate cries gradually subsided into exhausted hiccups. Julian turned his focus back to Genevieve. She was slipping away. He understood the lethal mechanics of the cold blood retreated to the vital core, leaving the extremities to perish. He stripped the frozen navy greatcoat from her body. Underneath her gown was a tragedy of thin patched calico that belonged on a scullery maid, not the daughter of a viscount. The hem was frozen solid. He had to remove it. Swallowing hard, Julian unfastened the buttons of the ruined frock, his knuckles brushing against her icy skin. He stripped her down to her linen shift, refusing to acknowledge the sharp prominence of her collarbones or the hollow hollows beneath her ribs. Dragging a heavy wool blanket from an antique chest, he swaddled her tightly and dragged the entire cot across the floorboards until it sat inches from the blazing hearth. Then he sat upon a 3-legged stool, resting his elbows upon his knees, and stared into the fire. 14 months. 14 months prior, the cathedral had been reserved, the settlements drafted, and a diamond of immense value purchased for her hand. Then 72 hours before the nuptials, he had arrived at her family's Mayfair residence to find it shuttered. No letter, no farewell, only an empty house and vicious rumors whispering that Lady Genevieve Thorne had eloped with a penniless debtor to escape her father's ruin. Julian had torn Mayfair apart in his fury, then abruptly ceased his search. He had rebuilt the fortifications around his heart with stone and spite. And now the winter had cast her back at his feet. Genevieve stirred. Julian went rigid. A low-pained moan parted her cracked lips. Her lashes fluttered beneath the heavy weight of exhaustion. Slowly she opened her eyes. They were hazel, the color of crushed autumn leaves, though presently clouded with fever. She stared at the rough rafters, then at the orange blaze, and gasped a terrible, ragged inhalation. Her hands clawed at her shift. My baby." Her voice sounded like pulverized glass. She attempted to rise, but her strength collapsed, throwing her back against the pallet. "Alexander." "Where?" "He is safe." The baritone emerged from the shadows. Genevieve froze. Slowly she turned her head. Julian sat beside the hearth, the firelight casting deep, severe hollows across his angular jaw and dark, unreadable eyes. He sat motionless like an ancient stone carving. Genevieve's breath ceased. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her head into the straw mattress. "I have perished," she whispered. "The Moor has taken me. This is my damnation." "No damnation," Evie, Julian replied quietly, rising to his full height. He lifted the warm bundle of wool from the hearth and approached the cot, extending the child toward her. Merely Yorkshire. Genevieve did not look at him. She snatched the infant with frantic ferocity, burying her face into his sparse hair, her thin shoulders convulsing with dry, silent sobs. She checked his tiny fingers, his toes, his warm brow, confirming he lived. Julian watched her. A sharp, sickening pang twisted in his gut, not of resentment toward the child, but of profound envy for the fierce, absolute devotion she poured into the babe. A devotion she had once pledged to him. "You look dreadful," he remarked. The words were callous, designed to re-establish the defensive distance he required to survive. Genevieve looked up. The terror in her eyes had hardened into a familiar defensive fatigue. "You were ever the master of courtly flattery, Your Grace." Julian flinched. "Your Grace. Not Julian. Whose child is he?" The question ripped from his throat before he could suppress it, raw, bleeding with suppressed bitterness. Genevieve gathered the infant tighter against her chest. She looked toward the flames. "He is mine. That much is self-evident. Who fathered him? It is of no consequence." Julian took a menacing step forward, his aristocratic composure shattering completely. "No consequence. You vanished 3 days before our wedding. You cast me into the public humiliation of the entire peerage. You obliterate your own reputation, and 14 months later, I drag you from a snowbank with a nameless child swaddled in my coat. I believe it is of immense consequence, Genevieve." She met his gaze, her hollow eyes igniting with a flicker of her old defiance. "You imagine yourself the sole victim, Julian. You believe my departure was an act against you. Was it not? I fled to preserve our lives," she cried out, the strain triggering a violent fit of coughing that bent her double over the child. Julian stepped forward instinctively, his hand reaching out. "Evie, do not touch me," she wheezed, shrinking back against the rough log wall. "Do not." Julian dropped his hand. He stepped back into the shadows, the silence rushing into the cabin like cold water. The fire burned down to glowing embers, filling the small cabin with thick, restorative warmth. Genevieve's shivering had ceased. The infant Alexander slept soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling in rhythmic peace. Genevieve sat propped against the timber wall, the coarse blanket drawn to her collar. She watched Julian. He had discarded his waistcoat, rolling his fine linen sleeves to his elbows as he tended the hearth with mechanical focus. He appeared older, harder. The subtle warmth she remembered in his expressions had hardened into cold lines around his mouth. "I never anticipated looking upon your face again," she confessed quietly, the anger spent, leaving only bone-deep weariness. Julian did not look back as he placed an oak log upon the grate. "I ensured it. I instructed my solicitors to destroy any correspondence bearing your seal." Genevieve offered a dry, joyless laugh. "I dispatched no letters." That arrested him. He turned his dark eyes, catching the embers. "Why?" "Because you believed I would turn you away. Because you would not have credited the truth." Julian walked to the small casement, staring out into the roaring gale. "Try me." Genevieve looked down at her hands, her knuckles split rough and abraded. "My father," she began, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the wood, "did not merely squander our family fortune at the hazard tables, Julian. He lost funds that belonged to Lord Malachi Vance." Julian turned sharply. "Vance?" The name tasted like poison. Vance was a parasite who operated in the shadows of the docks, smuggling rings, gaming hells, and merciless usury. A monster wrapped in bespoke velvet. Why in God's name was your father indebted to that butcher? "Vance promised to triple his stake," Genevieve whispered. "Instead, he seized every asset we possessed, then demanded immediate settlement of the remainder." "How much?" £30,000. Julian's face drained of color. 30,000. My father was entirely bankrupt, so Vance presented an alternative. She met Julian's eyes directly, tears glistening in the firelight. "He demanded me." Julian's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "No." Vance sought an earl's daughter to purchase legitimacy in Mayfair society. He swore that if I refused, he would have my father cast into the Fleet prison and ruin my younger sisters across the town. He promised to hunt us down until we starved in the workhouse. "You were betrothed to me." Julian's voice dropped to a lethal, vibrating pitch. "I possessed the wealth to settle the debt 10 times over. I would have crushed Vance like a viper under my boot." "You do not understand," Genevieve pleaded, her voice trembling. "Vance anticipated that. He cornered me on the terrace the night of the winter ball, the very evening you draped that coat over my shoulders. He told me that if I went to you, if I permitted you to intervene, he would assassinate you." Julian stared at her. "You believed I feared Vance?" "I knew you feared nothing." she answered, a single tear cutting through the soot on her cheek. "I knew you would call him out. I knew you would meet him on the field of honor. But Vance does not duel like a gentleman, Julian. He promised to put a lead ball through your spine from a dark alleyway. He promised to burn Ravenswood Hall to the ground with you trapped inside." I looked into his eyes and I knew he was entirely capable of every atrocity. A suffocating silence enveloped the lodge. Julian felt as though a blow had struck his chest. "So you surrendered yourself," he rasped. "I went to his carriage that midnight. I signed away my life to clear the debt." Julian looked at the infant sleeping upon the pallet. The timeline he had refused to calculate fell into place with brutal clarity. 14 months of absence. A 4-month-old child. The boy Julian said, his voice fractured. "He is Vance's." Genevieve closed her eyes. "Yes." Julian turned away, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the rough mantelpiece. He felt physically nauseated. The woman he loved, the only woman who had ever held his heart, had submitted to a monster to preserve his life. And the living testament to her sacrifice slept softly beside the fire. "Where is he now?" Julian asked, his voice deadly calm. "Where is Vance?" "Dead," Genevieve stated flatly. "His carriage overturned near the docks 6 months ago. He broke his neck on the stones." There was no sorrow in her voice, only relief. "His creditors descended within hours. They seized the townhouse, the furnishings, every gown I owned. They cast me into the street. I possessed nothing save Alexander and your coat." "Why did you not come to Ravenswood?" Julian demanded, turning back to face her. "Why freeze on the moors rather than seek my door?" Genevieve looked at him, taking in his power, his wealth, his unbroken lineage. "Because I am ruined, Julian. I am the destitute widow of a common criminal, holding a child born of his blood. And you are the Duke of Ravenswood. You loved an innocent girl who played the pianoforte and laughed at your witticisms. That girl died the night she left London. She drew the blanket tighter around the child. I could not endure seeing you look upon me with pity and revulsion." Julian stood completely still. He looked down at the navy coat resting upon the timber floor. He walked to the garment, lifted it, and brushed the soot from its lapels. "I gave you this coat," Julian murmured, "because the wind was cold. I told you it would keep you safe until I could bring you home. It kept us alive," she whispered. "It is the sole reason Alexander did not freeze in the ditch." Julian crossed the small room until his knees touched the edge of the cot. He did not reach for her defensively. He reached down and gently drew the woolen blanket higher over her shoulders. Then he sat upon the mattress beside her. "You are mistaken, Evie," Julian said, his voice stripped of all aristocratic pride. "I care nothing for the naive girl who once smiled in ballrooms. I care for the woman who walked into the abyss to keep me breathing." Genevieve's breath hitched. "Julian." He reached out his broad, warm palm, gently cradling the infant's head. "He is not Vance's," Julian stated, his stormy grey eyes locking onto hers with unyielding resolve. "Vance is dust. He holds no claim over the living. This boy belongs to you." His thumb softly stroked the infant's cheek. "And you belong to me if you will still have me." The fortifications Genevieve had maintained through the slums, the starvation, and the bitter cold crumbled entirely. Leaning forward, she buried her face against Julian's chest and wept. Julian wrapped his arms around the woman and the child, burying his face in her tangled hair. Outside, the blizzard raged across the wasteland. Within the stone cabin, the winter had finally broken. The gale subsided just before dawn, leaving a heavy, crystalline silence over the snowbound moors. Julian wrapped Genevieve in every blanket the lodge possessed, secured the sleeping infant within his own woolen waistcoat, and carried her out to the horse. Mounting behind her, Julian drew her back flush against his chest to share his warmth. The ride to Ravenswood Hall took an agonizing hour. Genevieve drifted between fever and consciousness, her shallow breathing brushing against his collarbone. Every time she went still, Julian would tighten his grip. "Stay with me, Evie. Keep your eyes open." When the wrought iron gates of Ravenswood Hall materialized through the mist, Julian did not pause. He galloped straight up the long snow-covered drive and halted before the towering entrance. Holloway, Julian's voice cracked the morning silence. The double doors flew open within seconds. Mr. Holloway, the head butler, stepped onto the portico, his professional composure shattering at the sight of his master, drenched in ice and holding a bundle on horseback. "Your Grace." "Summon Mrs. Gable," Julian commanded, sliding down from the saddle and carefully lifting Genevieve into his arms. "Warm the master apartment's hearths, blazing hot bricks in the linens. Dispatch a groom for Dr. Campbell immediately." Holloway took in the hollow-cheeked, soaked woman. A seasoned retainer, he asked no questions. "At once, Your Grace." Julian carried her over the threshold. The transition was absolute from the freezing desolation of the moors into a palace of warmth redolent of beeswax, polished cedar and cedarwood fires. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, hurried down the grand mahogany staircase, tying an apron over her dark gown. One glance at the woman in the Duke's arms made her turn pale. She had served the family for 20 years. She recognized Genevieve instantly. Merciful heavens, Lady Genevieve. She is starved and frozen, Julian said, his voice clipped and precise. And there is a child. He unbuttoned his coat, revealing the sleeping infant. Mrs. Gable's maternal instincts instantly overcame her shock. Give the babe to me, Your Grace. I shall have warm gruel prepared. Hannah in the laundry just weaned her own. She can nurse him. Julian transferred the child carefully. Keep him in your sight, Mrs. Gable. If any harm comes to that boy, I will level this house. The housekeeper nodded gravely. He is safe with me, Your Grace. Julian took the grand staircase 2 steps at a time, kicking open the door to his private chambers. 2 maids were frantically preparing the 4-poster bed. Out, Julian ordered. The servants vanished. Julian laid Genevieve gently upon the feather mattress, heedless of the snow staining the linen. He stripped away her soaked garments, wrapping her in a clean linen nightshirt, refusing to allow any other eyes to witness her frailty. As the heat took hold, Genevieve shivered violently, whimpering from the pain returning to her frozen fingers. I know, Julian whispered, tucking heavy quilts about her shoulders. It aches because the blood is returning. You are alive. Her eyes fluttered open wide with panic. Alexander. Where? He is downstairs with Mrs. Gable. He is warm. He is fed. Genevieve stared at the ornate plasterwork above the silver candelabras, the familiar scent of sandalwood that belonged to him. The fight drained from her frame. She turned her face into the pillow. You should have left me, Julian. Where would I leave you? Anywhere, she wept softly. A parish ward. A convent. Look upon what I have become. Julian sat on the edge of the mattress, gently brushing a damp lock of hair from her brow. I see you clearly. You are Genevieve. I am ruined. Then we shall reign over the ruins together, he replied softly. It required 3 days for the fever to break. Dr. Campbell, an elderly physician who had treated Julian since youth, was unsparing in his assessment. Her body starved itself to nourish the child. Your Grace. The frost was nearly the end of it. If she survives the inflammation, credit, her stubborn will not my elixirs. Julian never left the chamber. He took his meals by the hearth and reviewed estate papers by candlelight. When her coughing rattled her chest, he lifted her and pressed warm infusions to her lips. On the 4th afternoon, winter sunlight broke through the casement. Genevieve opened her eyes, finding the heavy weight lifted from her lungs. She turned her head. Julian sat asleep in the wing-back chair. His cravat discarded, his linen collar open. Stubble shadowed his jaw, and dark circles bruised his eyes. He looked thoroughly exhausted. He looked human. Genevieve moved to sit. The rustle of the sheets startled him awake. He was beside the bed instantly. Remain still, he commanded softly, placing an extra pillow behind her back. I am not porcelain, she murmured, her voice stronger than before. Julian poured a glass of fresh water and held it to her lips. Dr. Campbell begs to differ. Drink. She drank the sweet water, cooling her throat. Looking at his tired face, she offered a faint echo of his earlier words. You look dreadful, Your Grace. The corner of Julian's mouth twitched, the first genuine smile in over a year. You are resting in my bed, Evie. We may dispense with the titles. A flush colored her pale cheeks. Where is Alexander? In the nursery. Hannah has been nursing him. He eats with the appetite of a young wolf. He has your hazel eyes. Genevieve swallowed the ache in her throat. He has Vance's dark temper. He wails when denied. Good, Julian said flatly. He will require iron to navigate this world. A silence settled between them, thick with the realities waiting outside the chamber doors. What happens now, Julian? She asked quietly. I cannot remain here. Once the thaw comes, the rumors will spread. If society discovers you harbor Vance's widow— The rumors have already arrived, Julian said, picking up an ivory letter opener from the side table. Holloway reports that 3 separate inquiries from London arrived this morning, asking if it is true that I am sheltering a criminal's relict. Panic flared in her chest. You must let me depart. Provide me a seat on the Northern Mail. I shall change my name in Edinburgh. I will not drag you into disgrace. No. Julian, you must understand. I said no. Julian tossed the letter opener onto the table with a sharp crack, turning to face her with dark fire in his eyes. You fled once to spare my life. You will not flee again. They will ostracize you, she cried, clutching the counterpane. Your peers will turn their backs upon you in the House of Lords. You will be an outcast. Let them try, Julian said, stepping to the edge of the bed, towering over her. Do you imagine I care for Parliament? For invitations to Almack's, or the gossip of idle countesses, I spent 14 months in a polished hell, attending their functions and feeling nothing but dead ash. He leaned down, bracing his hands beside her shoulders. I am the Duke of Ravenswood. I hold half of Yorkshire. I control 4 parliamentary boroughs. I possess enough capital to buy and sell the estates of every gentleman who dares look at you askance. Genevieve's breath caught at the fierce conviction in his voice. And Alexander, she whispered, every time you look upon his face, you will see the monster who blackmailed me. You will see my disgrace. Julian reached down, cupping her cheek with immense gentleness. When I look upon him, I see a child who survived a winter tempest wrapped in my coat. He is a survivor, Evie, like his mother. I shall legally adopt him. He will bear the name of Sterling. If any man dares question his legitimacy, he may answer to my dueling pistols. Genevieve broke. The defensive armor she had forged in the alleys of London vanished. Reaching up, she caught the lapels of his shirt and pulled him close. Julian embraced her, burying his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of lavender and clean skin. The struggle is finished, Evie, he murmured into her hair. You are home. 3 weeks later, the thaw arrived in full force, transforming the snowbanks into rivers of thick Yorkshire mud, and with the cleared roads came the first intrusion of society. Genevieve watched through the nursery casement as an ornate town coach pulled up the drive. Behind her, Alexander let out a soft sound as Hannah patted his back. The boy was thriving, his cheeks round and pink. He grows stronger by the day, Your Grace, Hannah remarked warmly. Yes, Genevieve murmured, watching the carriage doors open. He had to be strong. Downstairs, the heavy knocker struck. Moments later, the sound of raised masculine voices echoed from the hall. In his library, Julian remained standing behind his oak desk. Lord Brampton stood near the hearth, stripping off his wet driving gloves. Brampton was a neighbouring baron who considered himself the moral guardian of the shire. The mud is abominable, Julian Brampton said, tossing his gloves onto a chair. I broke an axle near Tadcaster, but I felt duty-bound to ride out. Dispense with the preamble, George. Why are you here? Brampton sighed, discarding his cordial veneer. Scandal is like dry rot, Julian. Once it penetrates the timbers, the house must be cleared. Street James's is rife with talk. They claim you dragged Malachi Vance's widow from a snowdrift and placed her in your private apartments. The reports are entirely accurate. Brampton flinched. Good God, man, have you lost your faculties? The woman was married to a vice lord, a blackmailer, an extortionist. Vance was a corpse the moment he laid a hand upon her. Julian said, the temperature in the room plunging. The cobblestones merely beat me to the execution. Be that as it may, she bears his stain, Brampton pressed. Take her as a private mistress. Establish her in a quiet villa in St. John's Wood. Society will overlook that. But they are saying you intend to marry her, that you intend to adopt the child. I am. Brampton stared in disbelief. You are a duke. You sit on the Privy Council. If you attempt to legitimize the get of a criminal, he is my legal ward and soon to be my son, Julian. Interrupted, his voice like cracked ice. The peerage will cast you out. Your bills will perish on the floor of the Lords. Your name will be erased from every respectable salon, and they will tear that woman to pieces. Julian walked slowly around the desk. He stood inches from Brampton, radiating cold, lethal menace. Let them endeavour, Julian murmured. The first peer who cuts me in the street will find his promissory notes immediately called in by my bank. The first lord who opposes my legislation will find his shipping manifest seized for Crown audit. The first lady who breathes an insult against my Duchess will find her husband's gaming debts printed on the front page of the Morning Post. Brampton swallowed hard, seeing the terrifying resolve in Julian's eyes. You would burn the kingdom down for a ruined woman. I would burn their kingdom down. Julian corrected, and construct our own upon the ash. Now remove yourself from my house, and when you return to your clubs, inform them precisely of my intentions. Brampton offered a stiff, terrified bow and retreated. As the heavy oak doors boomed shut, Julian closed his eyes, rubbing his brow. The soft rustle of silk made him look up. Genevieve stood in the library threshold, wearing a dark green wool gown that brought out the hazel in her eyes. She had heard everything. They are correct, Julian, she said, softly, stepping toward the hearth. I grew up among these people. They will not forgive you for this. I do not seek their absolution. You require their alliance, she countered, her chest rising rapidly. You spent a decade passing Labour Acts building hospitals in the East End. If they cast you out, all of that work perishes. I will not allow you to destroy your standing for my sake. It is my standing to spend. No, Genevieve struck her palm against the stone mantelpiece. It is not. Because when they turn upon you, you will bear the blow. But I will carry the guilt I survived. Vance Julian, but I will not survive watching you become a pariah because of my past. Julian crossed the floor and gently took her hand, the hand she had struck against the stone, tracing the faint scars upon her knuckles. Your past was an act of courage to save my life, Julian said gently. My mistake was not raising London to find you 14 months ago. Power and titles are meaningless without you, Evie. I held this estate for a year in absolute solitude, and it felt like a tomb. I do not care if Mayfair locks its gates. We have Ravenswood. We have Alexander. He cupped her face in both hands. I am never letting you go again. Do you understand me? Genevieve let out a long, shuddering breath. Leaning her forehead against his chest, she whispered, I understand. 2 days later, Mr. Thaddeus Pemberton, the Duke's confidential solicitor, arrived from London with sheaves of parchment. The adoption of a ward is standard, Your Grace, Pemberton said, adjusting his spectacles. However, formally altering the infant's surname to Sterling prior to the nuptials is highly irregular. The ecclesiastical authorities will demand explanations. They will receive an explanation accompanied by a £5,000 donation to the cathedral restoration, Julian replied smoothly. Draft the instruments, Pemberton. And the inheritance, the lawyer inquired delicately. Under the law of entail, a non-blood ward cannot succeed to the dukedom. Genevieve tensed, the harsh reality settling once more upon her shoulders. Julian reached under the table, finding her hand and gripping it firmly. The title will follow the patent of creation, but my unentailed properties, the merchant fleet, the London holdings, and £800,000 in liquid funds I may bequeath to whomsoever I choose. Record that the entirety of my private fortune passes to my eldest son, Alexander Sterling. Pemberton's quill paused. The entirety, Your Grace. Write it down. That afternoon, beneath the stained glass of the estate's private chapel, Reverend Miller baptized the infant. Mrs. Gable held the sleeping boy dressed in an antique christening gown of Brussels lace. Name this child, the vicar intoned. Julian looked at the boy, then at Genevieve, whose eyes shone with unshed tears. Alexander Julian Sterling, Julian, declared, his voice ringing through the stone nave. The water was applied, the sign of the cross made. In the eyes of God and the law, the child was an heir of Ravenswood. They were wed the following Tuesday in the quiet stone chapel, with only Holloway and Mrs. Gable as witnesses. Julian presented her with no glittering diamond. That jewel belonged to an abandoned past. Instead, he slipped a heavy, unadorned band of solid Yorkshire gold onto her finger, a ring forged of strength and endurance, completely covering the faint scar on her knuckle. With this ring I thee wed, Julian spoke, his voice anchoring her to the earth. With my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. Genevieve spoke her vows with steady clarity. As the gold settled against her skin, it felt like an impenetrable suit of armor. The true test of their victory arrived in late March. Genevieve was in the morning room reviewing estate accounts when Holloway appeared at the door, his posture unusually rigid. Lord and Lady Brampton are in the drawing room, Your Grace. They request an audience with the Duke. Genevieve closed the ledger, rising with absolute composure. Do not summon the Duke, Holloway. I shall receive them. Holloway bowed with deep, genuine reverence. Very good, Your Grace. Genevieve walked down the corridor, her spine like iron. She pushed open the double doors. Lord Brampton stood by the hearth. Lady Brampton sat perched on the velvet settee, her expression stiff with aristocratic disdain. Neither rose nor curtsied. Good morning, Genevieve said evenly, stepping to the center of the Persian rug, the gold band gleaming upon her finger. The Duke is attending to the tenant farms. May I assist you? Lord Brampton flushed. We came to discuss the magistrate bench with Ravenswood. My husband reviews magisterial matters on Fridays, Genevieve replied coolly. If you wish to leave a message, I will deliver it. Lady Brampton snapped her parasol shut. We do not leave communications with unvetted persons. Inform the Duke we shall call again when he maintains proper company. It was a calculated, deliberate insult, the kind designed to ruin a woman in polite society. Genevieve did not flinch. Her gaze turned to ice. You stand in my home, Lady Brampton. You will address me as Your Grace, or you will not speak within these walls. Lady Brampton gasped in outrage. How dare you? We know your history. We know what your husband was. Julian has lost his senses, but we are not obligated to tolerate your presence. Then depart." The voice came from the threshold. Julian stood in the doorway, mud-spattered riding boots on his feet, holding a leather crop. His expression was dangerously calm. He walked into the room, coming to stand directly beside Genevieve, his hand resting securely upon the small of her back. Julian Brampton stammered, "We were merely—" "I heard precisely what occurred," George Julian interrupted. "Holloway," the butler stepped forward instantly. "Your Grace, dispatch a courier to London. Instruct my agents to immediately foreclose upon Lord Brampton's southern mortgages, the full £40,000 due by the end of the quarter." Brampton turned the colour of chalk. "40,000, Julian, that will force me into bankruptcy." "I am entirely aware," Julian said softly. "I warned the county. You have insulted the Duchess of Ravenswood under my roof." "She is a criminal's widow," Lady Brampton shrieked. "She is the Duchess of Ravenswood." Julian roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers. "And you are trespassers. You have 90 days, George. Liquidate your estates." Brampton turned to Genevieve. All arrogance vanished, replaced by sheer panic. "Your Grace, forgive us. My wife spoke in haste. We meant no disrespect." Genevieve looked upon them with absolute indifference. Holloway escorted Lord and Lady Brampton to their carriage. The couple fled. Julian tossed his crop aside, turning to Genevieve with a soft smile. £40,000. That was rather a costly insult. I would have demanded 80,000 had they lingered, Julian replied, gathering her into his arms. "You handled them flawlessly." "I had a formidable teacher," she murmured against his chest. Spring broke over Yorkshire in June, washing the land in brilliant emerald green. The war Julian had courted never arrived. The swift financial ruin of the Bramptons served as an unmistakable warning across the peerage. Invitations to Mayfair arrived in stacks. Julian fed them all to the library hearth. On a warm afternoon, Genevieve walked across the south lawn toward the lake. Near the water's edge, Julian sat upon the grass in his shirt-sleeves. Between his knees sat young Alexander, now 10 months old, stout, healthy, and energetically attempting to chew on a dandelion stem. "No, young man," Julian said, gently extracting the plant from the boy's fist. "We do not consume the garden." Alexander scowled with identical dark intensity, striking his small hands against Julian's knee. Julian threw his head back and laughed, a rich, deep sound that warmed Genevieve's soul. She sat upon the grass beside them, her muslin skirts spreading across the clover. Alexander immediately abandoned the flower and scrambled into her lap with a joyful squeal. "Traitor," Julian muttered with a grin. "He knows who commands this house," Genevieve teased, stroking the child's dark curls. Julian looked at her, his eyes catching the gold band on her hand. "There is a cedar chest in the attic, Evie. Holloway packed it yesterday. What is inside?" "The old woolen blankets from the lodge, the torn calico dress, and the navy broadcloth coat." Julian covered her hand with his own. "I told Holloway to lock it away in the deep eaves. We do not need to look upon it again." "Are you attempting to erase the past, Julian?" "Never," he answered softly. "I will never forget what you sacrificed to survive. But we are no longer merely surviving, Evie. We are living. We have no need of the coat." Genevieve looked from her husband to her son, squeezing Julian's hand with quiet certainty. "No, we do not." She leaned forward and kissed him a kiss, grounded in absolute devotion, sealing an alliance that had conquered the frost. Behind them, the stone walls of Ravenswood Hall stood unconquered against the blue sky, built upon a foundation of unyielding truth. True devotion is not bartered in grand ballrooms. It is forged in the deepest winter of our lives, when pretense is stripped away and only loyalty remains. Genevieve and Julian proved that an empire built on courage and unvarnished truth is entirely unbreakable. Thank you for experiencing the complete story of Genevieve and Julian. If this story of sacrifice, redemption, and defiance touched your heart, please give this video a like, share it with fellow historical romance lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more grounded period dramas. See you in the next story. There is something deeply moving about Genevieve and Julian's story, because beneath all the grand houses, titles, wealth, and aristocratic society, the story is really about something much closer to our own lives. How easily people can misunderstand one another, how quietly people can suffer, and how important it is to leave room for compassion. The first lesson I would take from this story is simple: do not be too quick to judge someone's silence. Julian spent 14 months believing that Genevieve had abandoned him. From his point of view, the evidence seemed undeniable. Their wedding was only days away, and then she disappeared without explanation. He was left with humiliation, anger, and a broken heart. But the truth was very different. Genevieve had been carrying a burden that she believed she had to carry alone. She sacrificed her own future because she believed telling Julian the truth would put his life in danger. That is something worth remembering as we grow older. We often see only the behavior of another person, but we rarely see the entire story behind it. A friend may stop calling. A family member may become distant. Someone we once trusted may suddenly seem cold or different, and our first instinct can be to think, they don't care about me anymore. But perhaps we should sometimes pause before reaching that conclusion. Perhaps they are struggling. Perhaps they are ashamed. Perhaps they are frightened. Perhaps they are carrying a burden they do not know how to explain. This does not mean we should excuse every hurtful action or allow people to treat us badly. It simply means that, before we close the door permanently, we should sometimes ask one honest question: is there something I don't know? That question can save relationships. Another lesson is about pride. Julian's pride protected him for a time, but it also kept him miserable. He believed Genevieve had betrayed him, so he built walls around his heart. He stopped searching. He destroyed her correspondence and convinced himself that he had moved on. Yet beneath that anger, he was still carrying the pain. Many of us understand that feeling. As we get older, we collect disappointments. A friendship ends badly. A marriage may fail. A child may disappoint us. A sibling may say something unforgivable. Someone we trusted may let us down. And after enough wounds, we sometimes tell ourselves, I don't need anyone anymore. But there is a danger in becoming too proud to forgive. Pride can make us feel strong, while quietly making our lives smaller. So my advice would be, protect your dignity, but don't build a prison around your heart. There is a difference between having boundaries and refusing every opportunity for reconciliation. You can say, what happened hurt me, without saying, I will carry this anger for the rest of my life. If someone sincerely apologizes, listen. If someone explains something you never understood, consider it. If you were wrong, have the courage to admit it. And if you cannot repair a relationship, at least try to release the bitterness. You do not have to remain angry at someone in order to remember what they did. The story also offers a powerful lesson about forgiving ourselves. Genevieve believed she was ruined. She looked at herself through the eyes of society. She thought that because she had suffered, because she had been forced into circumstances beyond her control, and because she had a child connected to a terrible man, she was no longer worthy of love. How many people do something similar? We look back at our younger years and remember mistakes we made. Perhaps we chose the wrong person. Perhaps we trusted someone we should not have trusted. Perhaps we stayed too long in an unhappy situation. Perhaps we made a decision that affected our family. Perhaps we lost opportunities because we were afraid. And sometimes decades later, we are still punishing ourselves for those decisions. My advice is this: you are allowed to become a different person from the person you were 20 or 30 years ago. You are allowed to forgive your younger self. You are allowed to say, I didn't know then what I know now. You are allowed to begin again. The past deserves to be remembered, but it does not deserve to control every remaining year of your life. Another thing this story reminds us is that we should never underestimate the value of one person who chooses to stand beside us. Julian could have listened to society. He could have cared about what the aristocracy would say. He could have protected his reputation and sent Genevieve away. Instead, he decided that the woman standing before him mattered more than the opinions of people who had never lived her life. He even chose to protect Alexander, refusing to blame a child for the sins of the man who had fathered him. That is a lesson worth carrying into later life. At some point, we should become less concerned with impressing everybody and more concerned with being good to the people who truly matter. You don't need everyone to approve of you. You don't need every neighbor to understand you. You don't need every relative to agree with your decisions. You don't need to explain your entire life to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. As we grow older, our time becomes more precious. We should spend less of it trying to win approval from people who gossip about us, and more of it sitting at the kitchen table with someone we love, calling an old friend, visiting family, watching grandchildren grow, or simply enjoying a peaceful afternoon. Do not spend the final chapters of your life performing for an audience that was never truly part of your story. There is also an important lesson here about helping people without humiliating them. Genevieve was deeply ashamed of what had happened to her. What she feared most was not simply poverty, it was pity. She believed Julian would look at her and see someone broken, but he did something different. He gave her dignity. He did not treat her as a burden. He treated her as a human being who had survived something terrible. That is something we can practice in our own lives. When an old friend is struggling financially, don't make them feel small. When someone becomes sick or frail, don't speak to them as though they have become useless. When a neighbor loses a spouse, don't simply say, "Let me know if you need anything." Sometimes actually go and sit with them. When an elderly friend becomes lonely, make the telephone call. When someone is embarrassed about needing help, give that help quietly. Sometimes the greatest kindness is not what we give, but the dignity with which we give it. And please don't wait until someone is dying to tell them that you love them. This may be one of the most important lessons for all of us. We often assume there will be another Christmas, another birthday, another Sunday lunch, another opportunity to say what we really mean. But life does not make those promises. If you love someone, tell them. If you miss an old friend, call them. If there has been a misunderstanding with a family member, consider making the first move. If you owe someone an apology, don't let pride keep you silent. And if someone you love has been waiting for you to reach out, perhaps today is a better day than tomorrow. The story also reminds us that real love is not always comfortable. Julian's decision to stand beside Genevieve came with a cost. He knew society would judge him. He knew his position could be affected. But he decided that a comfortable life without the people he loved was not necessarily a meaningful life. In our own lives, loyalty is often tested in much smaller ways. It is easy to be a friend when everything is going well. It is easy to visit someone when they are cheerful and entertaining. It is easy to love someone when they are young, healthy, successful, and independent. The real test comes when someone becomes difficult to care for, when they are grieving, when they become less independent, when they make mistakes, when their health declines, when they need patience instead of advice. That is when love becomes something deeper than emotion. It becomes commitment. But there is one balance I would add. Loyalty does not mean allowing someone to destroy you. Compassion does not mean accepting abuse. Forgiveness does not require you to return to an unsafe relationship. We can love someone and still keep a boundary. We can forgive someone and still choose distance. We can understand someone's pain without allowing their pain to become our burden. That is wisdom too. As we get older, perhaps we should become better at recognizing the difference between helping someone and losing ourselves in someone. And finally, this story reminds us that surviving is not enough. Genevieve spent so long simply trying to survive that she forgot she was allowed to live. Her entire existence became about protecting the child, enduring hunger, escaping danger, and surviving another day. When she finally returned to Ravenswood, Julian told her something beautiful. They were no longer merely surviving, they were living. I think that message becomes especially meaningful as we grow older. Don't spend all your remaining years waiting for life to become perfect. It probably won't. There will always be something to worry about. There will always be another bill, another political argument, another family problem, another ache, another disappointment. But there will also be morning sunlight. There will be coffee with an old friend. There will be music you haven't heard in years. There will be grandchildren laughing. There will be gardens, books, walks, holidays, photographs, memories, and quiet evenings. So don't postpone all your happiness until everything is resolved. Life is not the reward we receive after our problems disappear. Life is what happens while we are learning to live with them. If this story leaves us with one piece of advice, I hope it is this. Be slower to judge. Be quicker to listen. Forgive when forgiveness is deserved. Apologize when you are wrong. Protect your boundaries without hardening your heart. Don't let old disappointment steal new happiness. Don't measure a person's worth by their worst mistake. Don't allow society's opinion to decide whom you should love. And most importantly, don't wait too long to tell the people who matter that they matter. At our age, we have already learned that life can change in an instant. We have lost people we thought would always be here. We have watched children grow up, friends move away, marriages change, and familiar places disappear. We understand now that time is not something we own. So perhaps the wisest thing we can do is spend what remains of it wisely. Choose peace over unnecessary arguments. Choose family over pride. Choose meaningful friendships over social approval. Choose forgiveness over decades of resentment. Choose kindness whenever you have the opportunity. And when someone you love is standing in the cold, metaphorically or literally, don't ask first whether they deserve your warmth. If you have the strength to help them, because one day all of us will need someone to do the same for us. And perhaps that is what makes Genevieve and Julian's story so touching. Beneath the romance, the titles, the wealth, and the drama, it tells us something very human. Sometimes people need not to be judged but understood, not to be reminded of their past, but given a chance to build a future. The past may explain who we were. It may even explain why we became guarded. but it does not have to decide who we become next. So my dear friends, wherever you are tonight, take a moment to think of someone who has mattered to you. Maybe an old friend, maybe a brother or sister, maybe a child, maybe someone you haven't spoken to in years. If your heart tells you to reach out, listen to it. You may not be able to rewrite the past, but you may still be able to make the next chapter a little warmer. And sometimes after a very long winter, that is all any of us really need.